Hello, I'm Judy Trotter. I head up Adult Education and Learning at JW3. We've had some wonderful events over the last few years, and we wanted to share those with you while the building is closed. We do hope you enjoy them, and if you would like to, please do leave a donation on the webpage. In the meantime, please enjoy, stay safe, be well, and look after yourselves. And we look forward to seeing you when the building is open again. Bye for now.
Okay, well, you met Maureen before lunch, and some of you will know David, who has spoken here at JW3 on many occasions, David Herman. David produced a variety of arts and talks programs for BBC Radio, and now is a freelance writer and reviewer. Unbeknownst to him, so I've just sprung this on him, so we'll see what he can do ad lib. I've asked him if he would say something about literature. We've avoided talking books over these 3 days so far. We've kind of touched on it more or less. And let me just say something by way of preface, and then I'm going to give David a little bit of time in case he wants to say anything. He may say there's nothing to say, and we can move on from there. But 1967, which is our David, our kind of touchstone year, but we're not being too religious about it. We're talking about the 60s to the current decade, really. But in 1967, I happen to know that I was stricken for 16 weeks with glandular fever, and in bed for most of that time. And if you know anything about glandular fever, it leaves you feeling pretty useless. And my brother, Michael, who was and remains a saint, came in every day from school and read me, one bit at a time, The Lord of the Rings through that 16 weeks. I just was too tired to read anything for myself. And of course that was published 10 years previously, but perhaps came into more popular consciousness, I think, as part of that whole hippie, fantasy-ish vibe that was going on at the time. So that's a book I particularly remember from that time, as I say, even though it wasn't, it had been written earlier. But Frodo Lives, for example, was a big slogan in the 1960s too. So I'm going to ask David first, as I say, to say a little bit, if he wants, about literature then and now, as it were. And then we'll open up a conversation between the three of us about ways in which whether the 60s in fact did have any real impact, or whether it was just one of those efflorescences that just sunk back into the sand afterwards. So, David.
Thank you, Colin. How long have I got?
Oh, well, we've got 2 hours in total, so what about an hour and 15?
Yep, I would say something.
Okay, right. Maybe start with a quarter of an hour or so, 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, and we'll see where that goes. But if you've got more to say, we don't want to cut you off. We're going to take a little bit of a break in the middle, because it's quite a long session, 2 till 4. So in the middle, we'll take a 10-minute, quarter of an hour break. David.
Thank you. Tempted though I am by Clive's wonderful and generous offer, which I've just heard for the first time, I will resist it, because although there is something to be said about it, there's also some things to be said about what's left of the 60s, which I've been thinking about quite a bit over the last few days. So I'd like to, if you don't mind, if you prefer stuff on literature, then please just put your hands up and I'll go with that. But I'd rather say just a few things on what's left of the 60s. Because I think it's a fascinating subject, because as I'm sure you've heard over the previous sessions, there has never been a more mythologized decade, certainly not in the 20th century, I don't think any century actually. So it's quite interesting to look at some of the ways in which things were missing from the 60s that we think are today tremendously important and didn't really feature in the 60s. And those things in the 60s that were enormously important then and seem to be less important now. So firstly, one thing I would like to say is that there is now kind of new revisionist history of the 60s, which is kind of replacing a lot of the mythologizing. So most of the sort of memoirs by celebrities and people who were very much involved in the 60s are very much about, that was amazing, everything changed, it was all incredible. And increasingly now, when you look at some new history writing about the 60s, people are saying, actually, you know what? it wasn't that big a deal in the ways we think it was. So we think it was all about the Rolling Stones, and we think it was all about the Beatles, and we think it was all about rock music. But actually the albums that topped the charts, the album charts, were things like the soundtrack of The Sound of Music or South Pacific. It was the decade when the Bernie Inn started. It was one of the most popular films, two of the most popular films in 1967 were Dr. Dolittle and The Jungle Book. So it's very easy to forget that while in particular areas of London, particular areas of New York, particular streets in Paris and Prague, very dramatic things were going on. If you were living in a small village outside Sunderland, or if you were living in South Wales, or if you were living somewhere in the Midwest, your life was not being changed in the same way, and I think it's very important to bear that in mind. There was a massive sort of regional divide. So when we talk about the 60s, what we tend to think about is Grosvenor Square demonstrations, riots in Chicago, demonstrations in Paris, things in the big cities. What we tend not to think about is what was going on elsewhere. Similarly with the politics, we think, well, the 60s was all about radical protest, it was all about students demonstrating and rioting, it was all about the new left. But there was actually, starting in 1967, there was a tremendous backlash by the right against the left, which started with, very early 1967, Ronald Reagan was elected as governor of California. The GLC went conservative in 1967. Ted Heath was elected Prime Minister in 1970. Charles de Gaulle won by an enormous majority in the June 1968 elections. So again, we think it was a time of the left. Actually, in many ways, it was a time of the right. Not just at that time, but then subsequently. Because so many people in Middle America, and indeed in Middle England, and indeed in La France Profonde, were so appalled by what had happened in 67, 68, that they went to the right. And so for decades afterwards, you have conservative rule on and off in Britain, you have conservative rule in France, and you have Republican rule in the United States. And indeed, the more right-wing Labour was, after 67, 68, the more successful it was. So, for example, the Republicans were in power, there were Republican presidents for 28 of the next 50 years. Popular culture, we think of, as I say, rock music, we think of certain kinds of films like Blow Up with David Hemmings as a fashion photographer. We think of Joseph Losey, Harold Pinter films. We think of sort of very adventurous Jean-Luc Godard films, Antonioni, you know, these kinds of directors. In fact, if you look back at a lot of television, for example, during that time, think of something like The Good Old Days, which was an incredibly popular show, all white. The audiences were all white. Think of Dad's Army, which started in, I think, either 67 or 68, completely all white cast. I don't know if any of you ever saw, there was a recent clip shown recently of Lenny Henry's first appearance on television, where he was making jokes about his own blackness to an all-white audience. The way we think about race, when we talk about what's left of the 60s, one of the things which has changed beyond recognition is the way we think of race, the way we think of women and the feminist movement. So, for example, the Benny Hill show, which was taken off air by Jeremy Isaacs when he became controller of Thames Television, but, you know, incredibly popular show in the 60s. It is unthinkable that you could have a show like that on today. We're about to have the first woman Doctor Who. Would have been unthinkable in the 1960s. Homosexuality, we've just had a queer season on BBC Two and BBC Four. We've got a gay assistant on Doctor Who. We've got popular shows like Little Britain. Graham Norton, one of the most popular presenters on television. All of that, again, would have been unthinkable in the 50s. That's in the 60s. Some of that started in the 60s. Those kinds of movements began. Gay liberation, women's rights, and certainly black rights. But that has really accelerated, and that is perhaps the strongest legacy of all. But what about some of the things that are missing? Computers, high-tech, robots. There is almost nothing in the literature about 67, 68, about these tremendous breakthroughs which have changed our daily lives beyond recognition. The economy, think how little there is. You look at the interviews of people like Daniel Cohn-Bendit, one of the leaders of the French events in 68, or Angela Davis, all these kind of key figures of 68. How often do they talk about the economy? Barely at all. And yet one of the reasons the late 60s mattered so much was because you have that moment of transition, a huge turning point from the affluence which had dominated the West from just after the Second World War right through to the early 70s. And then from the early 70s, as we know, OPEC, oil price rises, unemployment, inflation, deindustrialization, and so on and so forth, old working class communities destroyed, the legacy of which we're still living with today. That moment in the late 60s was the moment just before things sort of turned in that respect. America in the 60s is quite interesting. The two countries that were, Britain was peripheral to the 60s, really. I mean, I know we all get very nostalgic about the music and the films and so on and so forth, but actually, in terms of politics, in terms of radical change, Britain was right on the margins. The real two centres were America and France, particularly the American South at first, and then the American cities, and France, both of which, not coincidentally, had just, or were just in the process of having bitter, divisive colonial wars. The French in Algeria and Indochina, the Americans obviously in Vietnam. And that really was what radicalised, what really drove the most profound changes that were going on, the most profound struggles that were going on. And what legacy did those things have? In France, virtually none, because of the huge demographic changes. What are the big issues in France today? Muslims. Muslim violence, Muslim poverty, that's the real issue. There's nothing about that in 67, 68, because there were very few Muslims compared to today. In America, by contrast, the black movement was one of the most dynamic movements in the 60s, with civil rights and later riots in the big American cities. Since then, you've had a complete catastrophe that's overwhelmed the black community in the United States. Catastrophe in terms of education, catastrophe in terms of housing, catastrophe in terms of drugs, catastrophe in terms of dysfunctional families. None of that. You can get out as many newsreels as you like of Angela Davis being interviewed, the Black Panthers being interviewed. You won't see any of that at all. So oddly, there were so many dogs that didn't bark, so many elephants that were in so many rooms, that actually, when we talk about the legacy of the 60s, it's really a surprisingly complicated thing. Finally, one last issue, colonialism and post-colonialism. One of the things that drove the 60s, what started the 60s off, was Algeria in the late 50s, and Algerian independence, the struggle for independence against France, Vietnam and Indochina, Cuba, and Castro. Incredibly exciting times. Now, when we think about Castro, we're more likely to think about the intolerance towards gay rights than we are to fly an icon of Castro. China, how excited are we about the Cultural Revolution? Well, quite excited, but we're more likely to be counting the tens of millions of bodies rather than thinking this is the way forward for the rest of the world. Algeria, which absolutely radicalized a generation on the French left through the 60s. Nowadays, we would think of terrorism, we would think of poverty, we would not think in the same way of a way forward coming from Algeria. So what is left of the 60s, and now I'll finish, are surprising number of absences of things that people weren't talking about in the 60s. And what they were talking about, we look back with some incredulity about, well, that's all very fine for all you young, well-off students in the 60s, but actually, just waiting around the corner were social and economic changes right across the Western world, which were going to devastate the West and whose legacy we're dealing with now. So that's just a sort of start-off point for everybody.
Well, thank you. After 3 days of soaring into the air, that brought us thudding inexorably to the ground. Thank you for that, David. We have, in fact, over the 3 days, I think...
Covered all of that!
No, I wasn't going to say that at all, but I think we've touched on some of those issues in different ways. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the programme we've been covering, but we had a presentation from Mike Wine about the Cold War and the effects that did have, and whether we're back in that same game or not, and those kinds of things. Talked a little bit about the breakdown of colonialism and the regroupings in international circumstances and so on. But that's an extremely helpful sort of reality check, I guess. Because of course when you live in the midst of something too, you know your own experience, and the capacity to get perspective is extremely hard. So thank you. Maureen, you said there was something you wanted to add or say. Was that particularly around books?
That was around books, but before that, I'm squirming a bit because you're so right. Not only does Angela Davis not talk about economy, but I also don't talk about the economy. And I mentioned to my children who are in their 20s, I said, what's left over of the 60s? And I'm really sorry that I asked because I got told. And these are the classic, 20 mid-20s who are living at home. This comes from a place very deep, you see, I'm sharing this one. And we made a mess, basically, and we didn't think ahead. And that mess is now for them to clear up, according to my children, which was very interesting. All this idealism, where did it actually go practically, was something that was thrown at me very, very strongly. Just responding to that. Very interesting, but I just want to get back to Frodo. Can I just get back to Frodo and literature?
Because he does still live.
Because he does still live. Though, I must say, if somebody had read that to me, I would have had no incentive to recover from lounge fever, and I'd still be there in bed with the duvet over my head without question, but that's just me. We spoke this morning about the two forces in music, that on the one hand there was this lovely return to an older ideal, a gentler time, yes, the pre-Raphaelite look, the hippie, the flowers in the hair, etc. And I'm going to put, and also drawing on sort of myths from the medieval period, I'm putting Frodo in that bag. But we also have the Stones singing Let's Spend the Night Together, and you've got, so there's Clive hearing Frodo being read to him, but in 1967 Portnoy's Complaint gets published by Philip Roth. And could I just say a couple of sentences about that, because I just want to talk Jewish for a moment, if I may. It is a very, very interesting thing to me that when Philip Roth publishes Portnoy's Complaint, the literary world is really, really not sure what to do with him. But the Jewish world is very, very sure what to do with him, which is hopefully that he'll die very, very soon, and for having brought such mass shame upon the Jewish community writing in the way he does. However, I don't think English Jews appreciated that actually he'd already got himself into much more serious trouble in 1959. Because in 1959, when he really hit the American publishing world with Goodbye Columbus, that's when the Jewish world really went to pieces, actually. There's Philip Roth exposing the Jewish community not as being young boys obsessed with sex, but as being, having really lost their moral compass and just being very bourgeois and very materialistic and not honest and not these fighting immigrants just wanting a comfortable life and looking very inwards and being all the things that he really, really felt very strongly about. It was in '59 that he received death threats and being told that he was terribly anti-Semitic and being responsible for the shaming of the Jewish nation because he wrote about Jews who were quite unpleasant and a betrayer of the race. You know, he's called really very, very severe things. He kind of sticks his head down for a bit. And then in 1967, he thinks, well, what the... And he writes this extraordinarily, explosively brilliant, deliberately very provocative book, I think, which says new things about Jews, and people just did not know how to deal with this, oh, Jews aren't what we thought they were. It really did. He really was, Portnoy was a game changer in '67. I mean, it was on one level just part of the more frank publishing stuff that was come out, writing about sex in a certain way. But it was also about writing about psychoanalysis, of course, the book being based on a conversation, a monologue between its hero and the analyst, who only says one sentence at the end, so now we may begin. It's just very, very funny. So I just think that is really interesting because Roth publishes that. That's really what I wanted to say.
Well, it's interesting that you say that.
So you've got Frodo and you've got Portnoy.
Right.
who never speak.
I mentioned yesterday or the day before, I can't remember, that also in 1967, if Portnoy's complaint was the Rolling Stones, the Beatles was The Graduate, which also came out in 1967. And of course much, not exactly kindly, but much more gently, revealed the aspirations of the settled Jewish middle class, and eventually the sort of long, slow learning of the graduate to give up on that, to get away from it, and leave it behind. And that's all sort of goes off into soft focus, into the Hollywood sunset. But nevertheless, as I say, if you've got the sort of in-your-face nature of Portnoy's complaint, you've got the gentler, but nonetheless quite revealing mainstream film, which says something very challenging, actually, about young people's, and this is a nerdy young person's response to the aspiration that his parents have for him. And The Graduate says, I think, very explicitly, do you know what, elders? We're not playing your game anymore. Even people that you might have expected to fill your shoes and follow on, ordinary, quite boring graduates, right, have tried to fit in, not playing this game.
And actually, if I can just respond to that, I'd say what they've got in common is they're saying what you see is not what's going on behind closed doors. That there's a veneer of respectability in American society, and if you just open a door, you'll see, for various reasons, it's not as simple as that.
What's the opening shot of The Graduate is a silhouette of Dustin Hoffman on an escalator as he's arriving at LA International Airport, with the biggest schnoz you have seen anywhere, certainly the biggest schnoz you've seen in movies since the Marx Brothers, I guess, which was part of this new emergence of a new generation of in-your-face Jewish actors, writers, directors, people like Mel Brooks, people like Barbara Streisand, who again didn't have the nose job, didn't do anything about her hair, and that was in the late 60s. That all really began to change. And one other thing, just if I may, which changed. You mentioned Philip Roth. Let me throw in Saul Bellow from just a few years later, Mr. Saller's Planet, which is the first novel he writes that directly engages both with what's happening in the 60s in terms of blacks and race and protest, but also about the Holocaust. Saul Bellow does not write very much about the Holocaust before then. And indeed, Cynthia Ozick writes to him at some point in the 60s or 70s to say, what was it with you? Why did you not touch on this biggest and most important of all Jewish issues? And he wrote back a letter of apology to Cynthia Ozick saying, yes, of course we should have done that. Of course. And in 1959, in fact, Bellow went to Poland to visit the death camps for the first time. And that began to change not only his perception, but everybody's perception of the Holocaust, because that changed from the late 1950s after 15 years of relative silence. And suddenly we get, in the 60s, it's not something you associate with the 60s. The 60s is a very mysterious and complicated decade. But one of the things that starts to emerge is awareness and consciousness of the Holocaust, both by novelists, historians, and so on.
And it's interesting you mentioned Saul Bellow, because I think Saul Bellow's way of dealing with it was from the sidelines. He was the one who got Elie Wiesel on television, and he translates Isaac Shamsing's stories into English. So he's kind of helping it along, but he's not actually getting involved himself, which is interesting.
One of the most significant Holocaust openers, I suppose, for the topic was a little leaflet, which I think was a reprint of a series of articles in the Daily Mail, if I remember rightly, called Letters to My Daughter. I can't now remember who the writer was, but it was in response to the growing vociferousness. I mentioned yesterday that another thing that happened in 1967 was the founding of the National Front, bringing together two previous parties, not least the Union of British Fascists, by A.K. Chesterton. And that produced an intensification of Holocaust denial. Did 6 Million Really Die, and various other leaflets, things came out at that time. And this little booklet called Letters to My Daughter was written by a non-Jewish journalist, I wish I could remember his name, writing to his daughter, talking about a matchbox full of ash that when he dies she may well find in his desk drawer, and he feels he should write to her and explain to her what this is. And he talks about going into Bergen-Belsen, liberating it and so on. Whether it's true or whether it's fictional is not clear to me, but nevertheless it was one of the first very explicit articulations of the Holocaust since the shock newsreel of Dimbleby going into Bergen-Belsen, showing it, I think once, was it, or twice, and then they immediately took it off. It was just too upsetting for everybody, and that was the end of the British North Sea. To come to this business of Jewish writers, and no, Jewish noses, back to Jewish noses, and that sort of readiness to be out and proud. We also mentioned that in 1967 the Afro was born, which was another out and proud act. Instead of blacks desperately trying to plaster their hair down or cut it away or whatever it was so that you couldn't see it. And let's remember, there was nobody in Africa wearing an afro, right? This was an American thing. It was an American assertion about we're going to be black as we can possibly be. Which of course didn't need to be said in Africa because Africans were in Africa anyway. But what happened in the 60s, and I think Jews were quite, well, certainly Jews in Britain, were quite slow to get on this particular wagon, was the rise of multiculturalism and ethnic assertiveness. Again, yesterday we talked a bit about the arrival of Asians and Indian restaurants. You said about the Bernie Inns being founded, I think it was 1965, 66, Bernie Inns came in. The Bernie Inns were interesting because they were the first, I would say, really popular chain of English restaurants for ordinary people. Until then it would be quite difficult to get English food unless you were going to go to some hotel or some high-end restaurant. Eating out was not what people did. Indian restaurants facilitated that process. So the arrival of ethnicity, the arrival of multiculturalism, I think happened in the 60s. If we're going to talk about whether or not the 60s had an impact on the future, can you draw a straight line from what happened then to where we are now? And a certain backlash against multiculturalism now? Or would you say that this, where we are now, is a radically different thing and caused by different motivations?
I would say it's very different because of the sheer numbers. If you look at France and the number of Muslims, if you look at Britain and the number of immigrants just in the last 15 to 20 years from different parts of the world, we forget how recently Britain was not an all-white, but a very largely white society, and how difficult that transition has been and continues to be. I mean, just this morning on the Today programme, I heard this sort of row going on about the question of the role of Pakistani men in child abuse and case rape and so on. So this, still rumbles on 50 years on in all kinds of ways. In the States, Black Lives Matter. The business in Charlottesville just last weekend of what do we do with the legacy of the southern states and the Confederacy. And I think these questions we're barely at the beginning, I think, of a whole set of issues about memory and what we do with the darker bits of our past that we're not very happy about.
I do think you can draw a bit of a straight line, and again I'm going parochial rather than global here, to men wearing kippot in the streets from the Afro hair, that black people celebrating black culture in the street led, I think, quite directly to Jews thinking, maybe I don't have to pass for white in quite the way that I might have thought I had to pass for white. And taking, and it was partly to do with Israel identification as well, wearing kippot in the street. But the Israel identification was much a younger thing. Whereas certainly elderly, very religious gentlemen in the early 60s, late 50s, who would certainly have covered their head to eat or something like that, would not have worn a kippah in the street. And it was much more of a hat-wearing, men wore hats generally, didn't they? Hats was a part of their culture. But religiously it was quite understood, this thing about being a Jew at home and a Brit in the street. But I think it was because of black people taking with the Black Pride movement that did lead to sort of Jewish pride in the street.
I mentioned that the Six-Day War, in many ways, and the newsreels of people walking around with kippot and being out and proud in Israel, certainly had an impact on my own feelings as to whether wearing kippah in the street was an acceptable thing or not. But I was always amused, even before that, with large numbers of Jewish men walking around on a Saturday, or who walked around on a Saturday morning wearing a bowler hat, except Jews on their way to shul. And I loved the fact that they thought somehow they were camouflaging themselves, so nobody would know they were Jewish. But the only people looking like bailiffs on a Saturday morning were Jews. So there's a strange Jewish tin ear to what makes them look like everybody else, I think.
Can I just throw in a slightly contrary point on the Afro?
Why start now?
Yeah. Every panel should have at least one troublemaker. Yes, Angela Davis wore an afro. Did Martin Luther King wear an afro? Did Malcolm X wear an afro? Did the Black Panthers wear afros? It was a very particular, iconic moment, and I agree it was an iconic moment, but it was a very particular moment. The same with the miniskirts. You know, of course we associate the miniskirts with that period in the late 60s. Now, let me just read you two quotes. One, both from Dominic Sandbrook's wonderful book, White Heat. Everything reached Hull about 5 years after it reached everywhere else. It was all about 1967, and everywhere else girls were wearing miniskirts. But in Hull, I'm sure they'd never heard of them. And then a woman who grew up in a village near Sunderland, it took 6 months or more for anything fashionable to reach the northeast. London was well into minis. It was splashed everywhere that this revolution in dress had taken place before any of it reached us. It was a long time before minis made it up north. In fact, I think it was about 1966 or 1967 before they reached our village. They may have worn them in Newcastle before that, but not in Sunderland.
Somebody from Sunderland.
Well, I'm from Newcastle, my wife.
When did you start wearing them?
I want to say something about miniskirts.
Go ahead, don't let me stop you.
I think we ought to be focusing on the really important issues here.
What else was that?
There's a real difference between miniskirts and afros. If you are shopping, you make a choice to buy a miniskirt. And I can remember the tremendous excitement of wearing miniskirts myself and being very aware that I might be sending out mixed messages, by the way, suddenly wearing these very short skirts that exposed my body. And I really wasn't quite sure what that was about. And whether we could wear them to shul or not was a big debate. A big debate. I had a trouser suit, for those of you with long memories, and I used to wear the jacket of my trouser suit as a coat. Just leaving it there, all right? So I did wear very short skirts. Angela Davis's iconic afro was not going out and making a certain choice. It was saying, this is how I am by nature. And all my life, I have had to, in order to look acceptable, straighten my hair, and the whole straightening of the afro hair was a very time-consuming, very laborious, and no doubt very annoying thing, because at the end you were trying to look like you were not. It was like the nose job every day, if you like. You would look and say, do I want to look like myself, or do I want to look like the way society wants me to look like? In a sense, it's the opposite. Miniskirt is saying, oh, I'm conforming to the dictates of fashion. Afro is saying, I'm going to be untampered. It was also quite exceptional to go without makeup.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up. I mean, first of all, can I say, David, I think I'm unmoved by your concerns about people in villages outside Sunderland, because I think all movements take a while to spread, and there are some places which are on the cutting edge or first adopters or whatever, and then they finally do, or they don't, impact. So my concern is not did people start wearing miniskirts in Hull the minute they appeared, but more did they ever wear miniskirts? Because if they didn't, if it didn't ever get there, then fair enough, it was just a preoccupation of the Metropolitan MDs. But if they did finally get there, even if it was 3 years later, then that was a movement or a trend or something like that. But if I can come back, Maureen, to your comments about makeup and indeed the afro, and push us on a little, David, you mentioned this, about the, not the arrival of, but the further shot in the arm of feminism in the 60s. As you commented, Maureen, the position of women in the permissive society was deeply ambivalent. Because on the one hand, there was this, be who you are, do what you like, take the pill, whatever, the world is yours. And on the other hand, there was still very much the role of the girl as the accessory to the boy, as the flower girl being pretty around the men leading the movement. And there were a lot of rejections of classic female modes in the 60s. But they may have only been cosmetic. I don't know what you think about that.
Without the 60s, I wouldn't be sitting on this side of the table, all right? There would be the all-male panel, really, and they would be the experts.
Well, but Maureen, we had to sign the pledge just recently to ensure that.
I know.
I mean, I've signed a pledge which was moved, I think, by the Board of Deputies or something, to not sit on all-male panels. I only did that 2 or 3 years ago. 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah. Yes, it's all, but without the roots of that, which do begin in the 60s, something happens that there are more women in the public eye, there are more women taking roles. There had always been exceptions, okay? You always did have the one woman Prime Minister, the one woman doctor, the one woman who had a doctorate. I mean, it's not so long ago. And I taught in a girls' school where the early heads had been to Cambridge but weren't awarded degrees, and that they were allowed to sit in the back and take notes, but they were not given qualifications. It seemed quite extraordinary now. It's been that long ago.
Miss Buss and
Miss Beale and Miss Buss, and and that you had to be unmarried to be working in these places. I mean, that seemed to be quite extraordinary, but that was true. Now, I was not the only girl in the physics class. I wasn't one of those. I was actually, I was given a lot of room to have a voice and to do the things I wanted. But I was actually doing those things in the traditional female areas of life. So I was talking, I was writing, I was in the school play, I was in the choirs, I was in the places that it was okay for girls to be. But I was aware that you didn't have to be, and I think this is key, exceptional anymore to be taken seriously. There was the beginning of the idea that actually the girls, later the women, had something to say. And certainly when my mother was growing up, it was a very exceptional female figure who was able to come to the forefront in that way. And I think that was part of a general democratising. Actually, it wasn't only about older people with qualifications who had something to say. In fact, you could even laugh at those people a little bit. I remember the birth of satire around that time, feeling incredibly liberating. That authority was there possibly to be laughed at. I wasn't yet ready to say authority was ready to be replaced. But I think the roots are something that has had an impact, which I'm not sure how we feel about this. The decline of the expert. Michael Gove tells us that we don't need experts anymore. I don't agree with him at all on that, but I'm saying that the roots of that kind of challenge was that perhaps ordinary people could get a seat on this side of the table, even women.
Well, the decline of the expert, of course, touches on something that we talked about this morning, about the interplay between high culture and culture.
Yeah.
But you wanted to...
No, yes,
I'm
I
sorry.
wanted to say something about women beyond the home.
Mm.
And it did not, I mean, there might have been a few little flickers in the 60s, but I mean, in the mid-70s, it was still, I mean, you know, when I was first looking for work in the early 70s, the first, and you know, I have to agree, but blah, 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 blah. The first question at any interview was, are you engaged? When are you planning on starting a family? So, you know, the fact that I had not Oxford, all of that was irrelevant. That was what they were. One of the interviews I went to was halfway through the ball. Someone said to me, said, look, you're much too young and pretty to be able to do a job like that. And that was, in 1974, still an acceptable thing that you could say to a woman. And, I mean, I've worked with the news now. And women like Linda Alexander, I mean, or there would be, you know, John Toos or whatever, the woman who got to do the news headlines was referred to as the programme wife. And this is well into the 70s. So, okay, you can say that there was a first little tweet about the role of women, but, you know, we're now still talking about women in the media earning a fraction of what their male colleagues are earning.
But I think the roots of it were just beginning to move, that you did see women outside the home, even if they were in a chauvinistic role, and even if it was incredibly hard to get there. And remember, in the 60s, a woman couldn't buy a washing machine or a car without the approval, the signature of her husband.
You couldn't get a mortgage.
And also,
without
you
it
are
being,
saying a question that was asked, when are you going to plan your family? Well, that's also the roots of being able to ask that question, is post a world where women were at least beginning to be perhaps in control of their family planning.
I'm just, all I suppose about is that there might have been this little
Yeah.
bit,
Yeah,
but you know, I think you have to go to most probably the age. Oh, and if you were, again, you're going out filming, you could have been the boss of the whole thing. The guy driving the crew van could refuse to work for a woman director. And this is again in the kind of late 70s.
Yeah.
So, you know, you have to go it took another 30 years. And it's still without equality.
Well, let's just remember, I mean, in any of these things, we are talking about seismic shifts in social attitudes, even perhaps more deeply than that, psychological positions. And so we certainly, even if somebody proposes, issues a manifesto in this year, it's not all going to turn around in 5 years' time. These are long, slow, generational processes. And we saw that, of course, with something like the rise of communism or the establishment of the USSR. I was both bemused and amused at the fact that when the USSR fell after 70 years of existence, within 20 minutes, there were people waving Lithuanian flags and singing the Lithuanian national anthem. And you thought, how did they know this? I mean, what were they doing for 70 years? Did they have their flag under the bed and go, just in case, learn the words, right? Because 70 years was as nothing compared to the sort of deep grip on prior attitudes. So these processes, they don't follow. I mean, you said I'd like to draw a sort of straight line, which I think is then not a straight line. But these things don't just kind of progress straight off, do they? They get knocked back, they come around, they approach it from another angle and so on. So I think we can readily accept that it wasn't just that somebody said, let's do feminism in 1966, and then everybody did it in 1968, and it's a long, slow process. Indeed, I had to rule out a similar sort of question chairing an NHS interview panel in the 1990s. So it's still there. Yes.
I just wanted to pick up on the initial point that David made about what's left over from the 60s. And I'm very much with you on that point. And I was struck by the V&A exhibition recently, saying it was a revolution. And if you look at that exhibition, in the sort of the UK part, it's all about Carnaby Street, Twiggy, fashion, the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper in the UK, and that what's going around in the wider world, you've got Vietnam, you've got all the uprising, the problems in South Africa, you've got the civil rights situation in America. You've got the space race, the Armstrong on the moon in 1966. So there's major things happening outside. You talked briefly about France and the barricades, but in little old England, we're focused on the Beatles, on the Rolling Stones, on the music, on the pop culture.
Well, I think, I mean, just to be fair, again, I mentioned in the, I can't remember what it was yesterday or the day before, that in 1967, Ariel 3 was launched. I still didn't find out who Ariel 2 or 1 was, but Ariel 3 was launched, which was launched by the UK, right? The only other, or rather the third successful space launch in that time. So the Americans had done it, the USSR had done it, and Britain was the third country to launch a space vehicle, Ariel 3. But that was in 1967. For what it's worth, and I don't think I changed the world, but in 1968, I was sponsored by the Schools Action Union, which is a sort of junior NUS, to go across to Paris to join the slinging of cobblestones at the police in the Sorbonne, and then over to Bonn to join the German revolts. So there was a sense amongst a certain subset of university students, certainly, and school students to a lesser extent, about being part of the sort of 68 movement. And of course I was at Grosvenor Square and Grosvenor Square and the Vietnam demonstrations. So these things were touching British society. I mean, admittedly, only a subset. But then again, I think that's probably true in America, as you say. Probably in the Midwest, nobody was demonstrating against the draft. So I think those things were touching British society. We had, both because it was bubblegummy fashion, but also because it was in the zeitgeist, pop music, which was anti-war. Very interesting to me.
Some was, some wasn't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I'm just thinking something like Hedgehoppers Anonymous. It's Good News Week. Someone's dropped a bomb somewhere, contaminating atmosphere and blackening the skies. Right now, it was a hit. I'm not saying it was a sincere political manifesto, but it was a hit. And such attitudes, and Donovan and those kinds of people, were able to get purchase in popular culture, expressing such attitudes.
Who sold more? Please Release Me by Engelbert Humperdinck, or Donovan's Universal Soldier? Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Nigel.
Right, Nigel. I think you've raised a really interesting point there, and I think one answer to that is that we had our colonial moment just a fraction earlier, which was Suez in 1956. And if you think of that moment in British culture and society, that moment of young radicalism, which led to CND, it led to the satire boom, it led to the angry young men. All of that was sort of clustered around that moment of Suez. And in a way, the reason Britain didn't have a 60s, with all due respect to Donovan, is that we'd already had our 60s. And that's what led to the Labour government of 64 and 66 and the hope that things would change dramatically there. And all the stuff with Tariq Ali and the New Left and all of that, the Grosvenor Square, that was trivial by comparison. It was trivial by comparison both with what happened in the mid-50s, and it was trivial by comparison to the larger social changes which we've been also discussing. Because those issues of gay rights, abortion, reproductive rights, and freedoms, the right to have a mortgage in your own name, the right to buy a car, that was a revolution. All the stuff with Tariq Ali, excuse me, that was just balloon juice, really.
Nigel, I'm quite offended that you seem to imply that my choice of lipstick might be a less important business than Vietnam. Because I certainly didn't think so at the time, right? Because one of the things about growing up in the late 60s was me, that there was suddenly the roots of a tremendous individualism that has caused us enormous issues, I think, down the decades, not necessarily been such a good thing. But there was a sense of entitlement of the individual, a certain encouragement of a narcissistic culture, particularly for girls who were, for whatever reason, encouraged to look in the mirror an awful lot, with an awful lot of products aimed at them, advertising relative affluence, consumerism rising, which actually I, as a young, selfish girl, was very concerned about those things. Vietnam was something that was going on over there, and that would be sorted out. But it's interesting that when I think about it now, you're looking at me, perhaps it was just me, that there was a feeling that actually I was the centre of the universe.
But the reason why you're saying that was all over there somewhere is because you weren't facing the draft.
Of course.
The reason America was at the centre of the 60s and Britain wasn't is because, apart from the race issue, that was one reason, but the other reason was that a load of white middle-class young people, mostly men, nearly all men, were actually facing the draft. If you'd been facing the draft, I think Vietnam would have suddenly seemed not over there, but it would have seemed right here in the centre of your life.
And it is, sorry, if I can just respond very quickly. I'm interested in the role of America here, because in the one sense, I think Brits looked to America with enormous admiration, didn't we? They had, JFK, it was where things were happening, it was where the money was, it was where the excitement, where the news was, the space race was. And I think suddenly Vietnam put a bit of a kick in that, or maybe it isn't the promised land after all, they have their own problems. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that, again this morning we mentioned this trend towards self-censored. I spent time choosing my lipstick too. I think that business of moving towards or thinking about my own place, my own preference, my own needs, not just the death of the expert, but the death of duty, responsibility to society. But I think, although you're absolutely right, David, that without the draft hanging over our heads, it was never going to be a sort of life or death issue. Those of us who were informed, and perhaps that wasn't a lot of people, but those of us who were informed were aware of the fact that Harold Wilson had resisted the American attempts to strong-arm us into the Vietnam War in a way in which, for example, Australia didn't. So Australia got involved, Canada got involved, but Harold Wilson didn't. What we were less aware of too, given that America seemed like the sort of promised land in the Golden Medina, not just for Jews, was the manner in which America was now calling the shots so vigorously on Western politics in general. Again, I mentioned this morning that the reason why we introduced drugs legislation here in Britain was because of severe pressure from America, who were worried about the arrival of narcotics, not least through Latin America, and felt that this was debilitating their young people. And of course a large amount of drugs coming through Vietnam itself, but they felt it was debilitating their young people and going to be less and less able to fight their wars. So they were very worried about that, and they wanted to make this a sort of Western front, and they persuaded Europeans in general to introduce that kind of legislation, which hadn't existed until 1964 in Britain, and I think similar sorts of years in most European countries. And we continue to live with the legacy of that without getting off the sense that drugs should be illegal. Exceptionally difficult. Although in 1967 again, we should remember that the legalised pot rally that took place in Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park.
Not in Sunderland or a village near Sunderland. Not in Sunderland.
Not in a village near Sunderland, no. But it's odd because although the village near Sunderland wasn't too bothered about the legalising of pot, it wasn't too bothered about pot.
It was actually. If you read surveys from the 60s where they went and interviewed people outside of London. You know, what's your view of hanging? What's your view of abortion? What's your view of drugs? Do you want drugs to be legalised? Should people be allowed to smoke cannabis? The vast majority, again and again, outside of London, said, no, we don't want cannabis to be legalised. We don't want drugs to be legalised. We want to bring back the birch. We want to bring back capital punishment. The 60s depended, and this is the point about the anonymous woman from outside Sunderland. The point is that there were two, but in Britain, in France, in America, doubtless in Czechoslovakia, doubtless in the Soviet Union, doubtless in China, there were at least two completely different experiences.
Well, I'm sorry, what I was going to say about the legalised pot rally was that the main speakers there were a local British fighter for the legalisation of drugs, I can't remember his name now, but also Ashley Ginsberg, of course, of the Beat movement, and I'm sorry, Allen Ginsberg, yeah, Ashley Ginsberg, somebody else, Allen Ginsberg, and several senior police officers who came to speak at the legalised pot rally. So remember, drugs had been made illegal in 1964, the legalised pot rally in 1967, and in those 3 years a number of senior police officers decided this is a silly thing, we're involved. I mentioned Norman Pilcher this morning, didn't I, who managed to carry out the sting on the Rolling Stones and get them in prison. Norman Pilcher in 1972 was forced to resign from the police force, was put on trial for perverting the course of justice and sent to prison for 4 years. So the drugs thing was perverting the police, and a serious problem on that basis too. But the reason why the village outside Sunderland, I think, was against the legalisation of pot, no less than it was probably for the withdrawal from the European Union, is because in those places where the direct impact is undetectable, there's a much greater chance of being afraid of what the direct impact looks like. So there's lots of evidence that people are much more resistant to immigration where there is little immigration than in places where there's a lot of immigration. So I'm not surprised at all that places that didn't have pot didn't want it legalised, because the only thing they knew about it was the lurid stories they would read. Whereas if their sons and daughters, or indeed they themselves, were having the odd spliff, they might feel very differently about it. But having said any of that, and to take your point again, you could have a legalised pot rally in 1967, but here we are in 2017, and it's still not legal.